by the way, will be up on, the previous recording that I made will be up on YouTube later this afternoon or tomorrow morning as well. I got it converted, and I was about to upload it when some people came into my office, and I had to talk to them instead. So when I'm home, I had this idea that I should never come to work because I can't get any work done when I come to work. I only get work done when I stay home. Because I get here and I'm like the camp counselors, like putting out all the fires because the kids have put too many logs on the campfire and it keeps lighting the whole place on fire. Venetian painting, right? On the left is Giovanni Bellini, the recognized sort of leader of the Venetian school of painting in the late 15th century. One of the teachers of Titian, one of the teachers of Giorgione. We don't have a really good Bellini Madonna and Child in the Landscape, but this one's all right. It's just a little kind of over-scrubbed to its age. But I brought it in with a Florentine example. So Venice, right, is a city in northern Europe. We talked about the otherness of Venice a week ago. Florence is really the epicenter of the Renaissance. And the beginnings of Renaissance art can really be traced to Florence through most of the 15th century. Most of the major innovations are there as well. And the things that we tend to think of as classically Renaissance art come from Florence. And so I have these up together to sort of talk about the fact that Venice is very different. And one of the things we're going to try and do is to look at what makes Venice different and trace that change. And so if you look at both of these, you'll notice that they're the one on the right, the circle of Filippo Lippi, it's much more cleanly drawn. Much greater interest in sort of a sharp, linear outline to the figures, right? Brightly lit, sharply drawn, whereas Bellini's is much more atmospheric. The edges of things tend to disappear into shadow. There's a sort of soft, hazy nature everywhere you look. They both have a natural background, but for Bellini, it's this, not only is it a landscape, but it's this sort of evocative sort of evening light, you know. You can see the sunset and how the sky is changing color, sifting through those clouds behind the Virgin and Child in the foreground, right? Colors are more suffused. They tend to blend into each other, and you almost get the sense that even though the blue on the right is incredibly bright, the one on the left is much richer in a way. And the shadows are not black, but they're a darker blue between the reds as well. There's no sort of use of black as a way of shading things. All of these things are sort of hallmarks of Bellini's art, Giovanni Bellini's art, and Venetian art in particular. And if we looked at the baby Jesuses, we can in fact see that. Look at the hair, for example, in the Bellini on the left, and you can see how that diffuse nature I was talking about versus and I mean this in the most respectful way possible, finicky drawing of the hair of the Filippo Lippi circle on the right. How the lines around Christ's eyes are, again, drawn with sort of linear precision. The areas around his fingers and hands. Whereas, you know, you get the sense that Filippo Lippi, or whoever painted it, Pesolino, is drawing with the brush. Whereas Bellini is really painting and exploiting what paint does, what color does, how it fades from light to dark. And we're going to be looking into sort of how we get there. Why is Venetian art so very different? But we've got to read about this already in the Fortini Brown article that we didn't have a response for, and in the opening sections of Humphrey's book that we've read so far. Begin to give us some sense of how geography and history in Venice feed this difference that we see. The landscape we were just reading about is with Jacopo Bellini, who's Giovanni's father, we see play out here in the background. There's this inexplicable trail behind Christ's head with what appear to be figures on it, right? Can you see them? Just here. Right? There's a couple figures walking on the bend of the road, but they're not there to elaborate on any sort of iconography. They're just a popular landscape. And you have that church along the path, and the path leads back into this gentle. And it looks very much like, and this is something that Joost Goedje talks about, the landscapes in Jacopo Bellini's works are either mountainous alpine highlands, or they look like the region around Venice, the Veneto, the mainland, right? And that's exactly what this looks like as well. So they're evocative, they're moody, they're not there for, well, they might be, but they're not obviously there for some sort of strong symbolic something like the roses behind the Pasolino Filippo Lippi work, which are very obvious symbolic elements. They're included for other things as well. The idea of establishing poetry, mood, sort of elusive meanings, right? So we'll begin to sort of think about what is it that makes Venetian art Venetian? How do we get there, right? And so today I was going to start with sort of the earliest Venetian painting that we've got in the National Gallery, Paolo da Veneziano. I don't know what his real last name is, right? But he's obviously Paolo of Venice. Is his name Paul of Venice? I think it's like a clothing designer, right? Paul of Venice, right? The Paolo da Veneziano is the image where Christ is now putting a crown on the Virgin Mary's head. This is meant to be a scene in heaven where they are the now King and Queen of Heaven together, sharing a throne. This is a motif that had become popular in the 12th century and continues to be popular through the later part of the Middle Ages. At this point in Venetian history, this very early part of the Renaissance, it's dated at the bottom beneath this seat. You can see that the figures' draperies are rather artificial looking, whereas Bellini here on the left is modeling in ranges of tone, right, with highlights and shadows, and modulates between these. Very simply gives you a sense of realistic landscape and atmosphere. None of that can be seen in the Paolo Veneziano. The draperies look, in fact, while they do form around the figure's legs, on the norm, they tend to default to this highlight and shadow only. So the highlights are gold. The shadows are the base color of the robe. Now, this is a bit different on the Virgin Mary insofar as her red robe is concerned, but if you look at the blue one, that's exactly how it's handled, right? Here's a detail of that. Right? And even with the red one, it's that way as well. There's some shading to the red, much less to the blue, but you can see that all of the wrinkles, all of the overlap, any kind of highlight and shadow is handled with this sort of duotone. It's either a highlight or it's not, right? And that gives it a certain artificiality that we'll see eventually change. Now, it's not the same everywhere. And if you look at the red fabric that the angels are holding behind her in Christ, it's handled much more effectively. If you look at the purplish red part of her robe, it's handled much more effectively. Their faces a bit more effectively. Christ's tunic, right? Around his chest a bit more effectively. But on the norm, much of the robing is handled in this artificial, very Byzantine way. And this is what we see in art that came out of Constantinople, going back through the centuries. And as we read before, it's because Venice was, in the early part of its history, an outpost, a trading outpost for the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine legacy, we've seen in a couple of different readings, is an incredibly strong one for Venetian art. And at the beginning of the 14th century, that Byzantine legacy is incredibly strong, right? Venetian art is basically Byzantine art. Part of this Byzantine influence, I'll give you a second, Jim, is a certain repetitiveness to the figural style, so this might come from artists using patterns, using a model book. So if we look at the faces of the angels behind Christ and the Virgin Mary, you'll notice that the two on the left look almost exactly the same. They all have the exact same swirl of hair coming off in that S shape, right, that you see here. It's the same everywhere you look, right? And each of the figures is the same figures, just sort of talked a little differently. But there's not a lot of individuality to the figures. There's not a lot of variation to what we see. Sam?
Is that a foot at the bottom?
Right above the numbers?
Yeah.
Are you talking about right here?
No, on Mary. Like that's.
Oh, that little black bit there. Yes, that's her toe. I'm pretty sure. Yes, and your point is just curiosity, or let's go back and take a look. So that's her toe. That's definitely her toe coming out. She's almost never barefoot.
Yeah.
Right? I don't. She rarely appears barefoot. At least in this period, right? Whereas Christ is often wearing sandals, and it probably has to do with the Roman heritage. That even though there's not a lot of Renaissance yet to the Renaissance, the idea of reviving something Roman, still images of Christ had their first birth in images of Roman emperors. Right? They were derived from that, or even people like Apollo, right, the Roman sun god. So Christ's sandals are a little bit easier to explain. I think the Virgin, you see, the thing for the Virgin Mary is that while there are some classical prototypes for her, there's also the sense of decorum and respect that you have to show. And I think open-toed shoes gives kind of a long message for the Virgin Mary. Right? So that's definitely meant to be the toe of her shoe there, pointing out just as a Virgin Christ. But it kind of miraculously appears like a tongue or something.
Yeah, and that looks like a Chinese.
No, but it does articulate, right? Because this is her leg, right? The other one is here, and I guess that's probably her other foot right there, right? There's a toe, there's a toe. But how's that for my figure drawing class, right? Right, there's her arms, there's her spine, there's her legs coming out, and there's her feet, right? I like having this little drawing thing. It's something new just this year. I do enjoy the heck out of having that, right? So, we're going to see something drastically begin to change as we move into the 15th century. We're going to make a fairly hefty jump here. We're going to jump ahead almost 100 years, partly because the later part of the 14th century was interrupted by the Black Plague. And that had a huge sort of dampening effect on the production of art in the late 14th century. A lot of people felt that opulence, elegance, even any kind of vibrancy that you're starting to see here was being punished by God. So they're turning their back on it. And then there's also the money issue, right? So we don't actually see this problem throughout Europe, and in particular in Italy. The Black Plague is 1348, right? So from roughly 1350 onward to the end of the 15th century, we see this sort of, right, like a Great Depression of art, where nothing was really much being made at that point. Okay. Now, as we move into the 15th century, we're going to start talking about things that begin to move us out of this Byzantine style and into something else. And one of the things that happens is in the 1410s, this artist, Gentile da Fabriano, comes from Florence, where he's working, and spends some years in Venice working there. And he's one of many artists from Florence who arrived in Venice in the early part of the 15th century. Okay? And this is a really important element of the development of Venetian painting, is this arrival of Florentine artists in Venice and the transmitting of their stylistic innovations to the artists in Venice. As I mentioned before, the Renaissance as a movement really very much begins in Florence and remains not uniquely, but primarily centered there, all the way to around 1500, when the papacy in Rome is finally reestablished in a powerful way. And then we get the Sistine Chapel, right? Then we get Raphael in Okay? But prior to that, the Renaissance is really primarily happening in Florence. And most of the major innovations in Renaissance art are happening in Florence. Okay. Now, the first sort of development for the Renaissance in Florence, well, we'll back up. Renaissance, should we take a second? What are we talking about? What does Renaissance mean? What does the word mean? Rebirth. Rebirth of what? What's being reborn? Classicism, right? And by classicism, what do we mean? What classicism as defined by whom? Right, classical Greece. Now, were the Greeks as important to Renaissance Italians, or was it another classical culture that might have been influenced by the Greeks that they were more interested in? And obviously,
you said Greeks were influenced by it?
no, I'm saying who are these Italians in the 15th century who were, even come up with this whole idea of calling it a Renaissance in the first place, right? But they're interested in the Greeks, and they're not really interested in the Greeks per se. They're interested in the ideals, but they're getting them translated from another culture. The Romans, right? It's nationalism. It's their past. As we read about Venice, one of the things we read was that Venice was very odd in that it didn't have any Roman ruins, right? They like to fancy themselves to be the inheritors of Roman tradition and the new covenant, right? The new inheritors of the great traditions of Rome. But they didn't have any old Roman ruins to actually look at, to be revived, okay? Around 1410, 1420, which is when, John Keely's up in Venice from Florence, the Florentines, while they had a lot of those to look at, weren't really all that interested yet either. And for them, what the Renaissance really meant was a style of painting that they saw in ancient Roman art, usually mosaics, but sometimes other things would survive, that was realistic, naturalistic, humanistic, as you said, right? So this is what the early part of the Renaissance is. It's very much a revival of naturalism, realism, that comes from responding to ancient Roman art. Now, it might also have been Greek art, but for them, it's really the Romans and the Greeks and their adoption of it, because for the Italians, it's a nationalism sort of thing. Okay? So, John Keely is working in Florence, which is the epicenter of this revival of the interest in naturalism, and he spent some time working in Venice. We don't have any of the works he made in Venice here, so we're just going to use this as an example, because it is here, right? It's a fairly large altarpiece he painted in Florence, but this is the style he brings to Venice. And as you can see, it is similar in some ways to earlier Byzantine influenced works, but it's pushing in the direction of realism. So it still has a gilded background, right? A gold, artificial, flat gold background. This stool or bench on which the Virgin Mary sits is sort of there, just like the throne of Christ and the Virgin on the right is sort of there, not really explained or given any kind of context. There's some bits that are kind of artificial, but then if you look at the figures themselves, you'll see I've got details that show them better. Even though the paint has darkened, there is this attempt to render things in three dimensions with the idea of the fall of light and shade, right? And there's an interest in humanism. If you look at Christ and the Virgin Mary, there's no sort of sense of there being an individual beneath the skin in the Paola Veneziano picture, right? She looks out at you. Her gestures are just sort of stagey, Christ is putting the crown on her head, looking sort of past her. They're not engaged with each other in any sort of demonstrable fashion. Now look at John Keely's Madonna and Child. That's how cute that is, right? He's playing with mom's clothes, and she's got him tenderly. And look at even the little ways he changes. It's this hand, isn't it? The middle finger and the way the index finger's bent just a little bit on that hand, she's holding his chest, and the other one that comes around the back and holds him. And he's got these little legs, he's got one's out like this, and the other one's kind of trailing behind. There's a sense of touch everywhere, right? That adds to that sense of intimacy. It's human. this is not just the Madonna and Child unapproachable icons of, unchanging. These are people that you might see. This could be any mother and child, right? And that's one of the great things of the Renaissance that Gentili begins to bring to Venetian painting, right? He was particularly appealing to the Venetians, as nice pictures, because of the opulence of the work. The brocade on her sleeves, you can see the blues and the reds with all the, what we call tooling, how the surface of the wood panel has been carved up before they laid the gold leaf down to give you all these patterns of flowers and the hatched backgrounds behind them. That certainly was very appealing to our wealthy Venetians as they come here. And here I overexpose this a little bit so you can see the degree to which the robe is modeled through tones of red to give you the sense of how it drapes across her knee. And you can see again down below, which is kind of fascinating, right? You can read words along the hem, and this is kind of common. And can you see this is Ave Maria? You see on the left? Further on, Gratia Plena. These are the words of the angels of the Virgin Mary at the Annunciation. Behold, Mary, full of the grace of God, right? Or full of grace, God is with you, right? So Ave Maria, Gratia Plena, Dominus Tecum. Right? Those are the angels' words of the Annunciation. There they are on her hand. I do have a detail. And exactly where Christ is touching her on her neck, it says Mater, mother. Right? So he's touching the word mother on her neck. Right? So these details, on the one hand, the humanist realism on the other, and the opulent colors all would be very much appealing to Venetian art and will become part of what becomes the idiom of art in Venice. Right? So Gentili Fabriano is an important figure for the development into the Renaissance, the shift in Venetian art from the Byzantine heritage into something that's running more closely parallel, albeit a few steps behind, to Renaissance art in other centuries. Right? During the 1430s and the 1440s, the Doge of Venice, Francesco Foscari, you don't have to worry about that. He begins to institute a sort of a social policy, a political policy that's much more welcoming to trade with Florence. And that brings, in the wake of Gentili da Fabriano, other artists from Florence coming in not only to Venice, but into the region around Venice, into the Veneto as well. Right? So we start to see early Renaissance art, early 15th century art in Venice, be a series of responses, in a way, to these outside influences, right? In particular influence from Florence, that kick-started into the Renaissance and really helped Venice to join the ranks of the other cities. And this is an important step leading up to a point where it starts to diverge from them in its own particular way. Okay? So that's where Gentili da Fabriano gets a step. We start to see artists in Venice beginning to respond to these Florentine examples, but in their own particular way. So the bright colors, the opulence that Gentili brought is picked up by, here's our first Venetian, well, our second Venetian artist, but the first from the 15th century that we're looking at. Michele Gambona, image of St. Peter, one of Christ's apostles. This is separated from a larger work of art. We'll talk about that in a second. Most of the paintings that we have at the museum were not independent, designed as independent works. They were usually part of a larger group of paintings hung together and through the years have been separated. Usually we can put it back together again, but sometimes parts have been lost. Right? So you can tell by the fact that he's looking at something that isn't in the frame, and by the fact that it's quite tall and narrow, but this might have been hung next to other works with a similar profile. Right? Now, here we're seeing the ways in which John Seeley and others, that we're not going to talk about so much, helped Venice move from the Byzantine heritage to this more naturalistic early Renaissance style, right? But they're doing this about a generation behind the Florentines, right? They're really running not even second place, but further back from that. Now, Michele Giambona presents to us as an individual, before we talk about the painting, something that we're going to see again and again in Venetian art. He is from a family of painters. Right? Other members of the Giambona family, beyond Michele, were active in the art of painting. Right? The idea of a cottage industry, where everybody in the family does a similar kind of art. Right? And this is true in a lot of cities. This is true in a lot, not just with art, but with other crafts, where if you came from a chair maker, right, you'll learn the trade of chair making from your dad, right? You guys wouldn't because it's a human angel, but the rest of them would because it's very patriarchal, right? Nature, male dominant crap, right? But one of the things we see in Venice more often than anywhere else is this idea of families of painters, legacies running through generations of painters. And so Michele Giambona presents us that first opportunity, right, to really talk about that. Here, let's see, what do I have a detail here? We see him bringing in some of the Florentine interest in sort of drawing, right, that we saw with the Pesolino work that's slightly later. So the hairs of St. Peter's beard are drawn, in his hair as well. But also, I think, an interest in personality, in individualization, moving away from those Byzantine images that were much more sort of cookie cutter stamped, right? This looks like somebody different than just any other saint. He looks like an individual. It looks as if Giambona is interested in characterizing him, not only with a particular age, which is important for St. Peter, but also as a particular kind of character, right? Insight into his psyche, if you will. Also, again, this interest in opulence, and these colors are fantastic, aren't they? It's just really hot. This is the National Gallery's photo on the left, but you can see that same interest in sort of brocading the detail along the hem. This is a bit more worn, so a lot of it's missing, but then even the realistic detail of St. Peter's key. You know that Peter holds the keys to heaven, right? In the Bible, when Christ asks Peter, "Who do they say that I am?" and Peter says, "Well, they say you're the Christ, you're the Messiah." He says, "On this rock I will build my church." Ha ha ha! Right? Peter means rock, and so he's making this cute little pun, right? But then he says, "On this rock I will build my church, and your words will loose heaven and earth." And this is why Peter is seen even in pop culture as standing at the pearly gates, right? He has the keys to heaven and earth. So there he has the key, and this is also why Catholics consider him to be the very first pope, right? Okay, so details, interest in details, interest in modeling, some of this opulence comes really out of this contact with Florentine art. At the same time, the colors are so extraordinary. Green and the oranges. And that goes back to something we've read about already, which is that Venice sits at this crossroads of trade, where some of the raw colors that you need, some of the raw materials you need to make paint with, are coming and being traded in Venice first before they end up other places. They have first crack at things. And we find a range of tonality and a range of color in Venetian paint we don't see anywhere else. And this sort of, I think it's ormolu, he doesn't worry about that. This kind of bright orange that you're seeing here, some people see it in the can. It's really fantastic. And plays incredibly well live. Right? And in the hands of like Giorgione, stunningly beautiful. Right? Okay. So there we are. This begins to show us the impact of works of art that have come out of Florence. Like I said, this is split up from other works. These were both in Florence in different collections now. There may have been more panels that did this grouping. You can see how the years have been a bit kinder some than others, and also how we didn't seem to care about the consistency of backgrounds in these. But the scale is similar in all three of these, and most of the experts in Italian Renaissance pictures believe that these three go together. St. Michael in the center, killing the demon. St. John the Baptist on the left in the wilderness with the hair shirt, and our St. Peter. And because of the way they're looking together to the symmetrical image of St. Michael, suggests that they were part of a bigger ensemble. And we can go to more technical studies to prove or disprove this. We can look at the wood it's painted on. We can look for drill holes on the sides and see if they match up. Right? We can look at old records and descriptions of works of art and find this out. All helps to paint the picture that these things probably went together at some point in their history and have been split up into different collections. Okay? Again, in art history, we're looking for not only what is depicted and how it's depicted, what that means, but we're also looking at the original historical context of things, which helps to explain it all for us better and give us more understanding into what we're looking at. Now, this early Renaissance picture, also in the National Gallery by Giovanni dalla Magna, artist who had emigrated to Venice from Germany. Dalla Magna means from Germany in Italian dialect, right? So Giovanni of Germany had emigrated to Venice. We read about the fact that Venice is this city of immigrants, very welcoming to people from the outside. And Giovanni dalla Magna is one of them. He establishes his career working in Venice and in the Veneto, right, the mainland. And he actually marries into the family of another painter. They have a trade working together. We'll talk more about that in just a second, right? But again, it's another part of this cottage industry. This work was also originally part of a sequence of work that showed us the life of Saint Apollonia, who was from the middle of the 3rd century. Right? So this is the first in the story of the panels that remain. Only 4 remain, there were probably more. We don't see her actually die, for example, right? Which she probably would have in the original series. Right? So, mid-3rd century, Apollonia is born in provincial Rome to one of the provincial leaders for Rome. He's a pagan. He wants her to worship the pagan gods, and she decides as a Christian that she can't do that, so she's going to go knock it down with a hammer, right? And that's the scene we see here in this rather elaborate architectural setup. This is, again, a picture where we might actually apply some of the ideas that Joost Gaudier talks about when it comes to Jacopo Bellini, where his elaborate architectural constructions allowed him to play with the subject matter, allowed him to elaborate on it, give it anecdotal detail, make it look more like an everyday scene, right? Give it some sort of interest that was beyond its original religious story. And that's certainly the case here with Giovanni dalla Magna. This is exactly the time that Jacopo Bellini is indeed working on this, right? So we could actually apply those ideas to a painting like this, right? So there she is. She's got her servants, her maidens on the left, helping her by holding her ladder for her. Nice little anecdotal detail there, right? They're steadying the ladder as she climbs her way up. She's barefoot. You see her toes are clinging onto rails, and she's put it up on this huge base to see the statue. Now, our Venetians haven't yet kind of figured out Roman statuary, right? They don't have good examples to look at, and it kind of looks quasi-Roman statuary, but not any specific example. They're not doing that kind of revival yet, where they're making direct copies of Roman elements, right? But it's inspired by, it's probably meant to be Bacchus. Bacchus is the god of wine. And the reason I suggest that is twofold. One, he's got that wreath in his hand, right? But two, if he's Bacchus, and there are statues of Bacchus look similar to that, it makes a nice dichotomy between this god of hedonism and a saint who's committed to piety, right? You get that, I'm not going to worship. It's not like just any god. It's the god of wine and drunkenness. So she's actually, in many ways, not just striking out against paganism. She's striking out against wanton living as well. And it helps to orchestrate her life as a saint. Right? So we don't see her actually destroying the idol. She's about to do it. And you'll notice that the architecture is really quite elaborate around her. And it gives you this stage set to include these other figures. I assume that the bald guy in the lower right corner is probably the father, right? But there are other ladies from the court looking on from that balcony up above. We'll quickly go through a couple details and we'll quit. On the base, we see the Roman eagle, the standard symbol of Rome. This is, again, Giovanni dalla Magna's attempt to suggest that this is a Roman monument, even though it's not based on any particular Roman monument. Just if you've seen enough things, you know, even to this day, right, all of the fountains and the manhole covers have eagles on them still, right? It's a standard symbol of Rome, and they knew enough about Rome to know that. Upper right corner, we see some of the ladies from the court looking on in wonder as Apollonia is about to take a few chunks out of the pagan idol here. And you notice that there's an inscription on the banister there, Eusebius. This is Eusebius, a reference to the writer who first wrote the legend of St. Apollonia in his church history of, I believe, the 4th century. Eusebius, who was Constantine's biographer, writes about the legend of St. Apollonia. So that's an odd little reference there, isn't it? It doesn't make much sense that would be carved into a building here. But it's sort of Giovanni dalla Magna's way of giving credit to the author of the story that he's showing us. And the story was then later developed, so by the time Giovanni dalla Magna painted in the 15th century, there have been numerous versions of the life of St. Apollonia, and the best known one is in the Golden Legend, the best place to look for any saint's lives by this time from the 12th century. And so the original story, which may have some seeds of truth, is then picked up on and developed again and again and again through the years. Right? Do you have time for just 2 quick more slides to see how the story plays out? It's kind of cute. Well, it's actually not kind of cute. It's kind of violent. Well, I presume it's the father and other members of the court. You'll notice how Giovanni dalla Magna tries to make them look a little bit exotic. Look at that great beehive blue turban-like hat that they're wearing that locates it outside of Rome itself and into the provinces, right? Okay. So again, this is what Joost Daugier is saying, that sometimes these elaborate architectural settings are there to allow the artist, in her case, Jacopo Bellini, but in this case, Giovanni dalla Magna, to play with how we receive the story that we're looking at. As I mentioned, this is part of a series of paintings, and some of the other ones survive. St. Apollonia, this is horrible, right? She has her teeth removed. They pull out all of her teeth. This is as they're going to martyr her right after she, disobeys her father, destroys his idol instead of worshiping it. She's going to kids got to be punished. So it's not the kind of way I'd punish a child, but they yanked out all of her teeth, one by one with pincers. So here she's tied to another romantic pole, and again, a very elaborate architectural setting. Again, notice the difference in perspective from left versus from right, which suggests maybe the original arrangement of these pieces, right? That people are just looking on as this is going, and they're yanking out her teeth. I always like this idea that maybe her idea of chipping away at the marble of the statue is a harbinger of what they're going to do to her, right? They're going to chip away at the marble of her mouth, if you will, right? Then she's actually blinded, so they pluck out her eyeballs next. It's just The saint stories are these elaborate saint stories are really horrific because they always survive these, and they're like, oh, no big deal, because they've got that the messages, they've got that kind of faith that it's not going to bother them, that they're going to. So she's although the pain and the suffering I think is very apparent here, right? When you look at her, if you can, I know it's a violent scene, right? But when you look at her, the pain and suffering is definitely most apparent. But the idea is, of course, for us who think that we're suffering day in and day out, it's really not so bad, right? It could be a lot worse. You got your teeth in your eyes, right? And then eventually her body is drugged through the city square. This is really badly damaged, right? But again, this elaborate architectural setup, we don't know the arrangement of these things. But something that my dissertation advisor, Colin Eisler, once said, it's like, if you really want to martyr a saint, just don't knock out their teeth and pluck out their eyes and drag them through the town square. You got to just cut off their head, right? Nothing else ever works, and sometimes even cutting off the head doesn't, right? So here's poor Saint Apollonia and her fate, but we see her in the National Gallery in a much more uplifting picture where she's standing strong for the faith. This is where we met her as she's defying her father. So Tuesday, right? We're down at the National Gallery. Finally, we're back here. We'll pick up where we left off with this, okay? And those of you who haven't gotten me your